The Red Web, a Necromunda novel, Chapter 3.
Captain Lau sipped his recaf in his chipped mug. The bitter taste wasn't enjoyable per se, but it was a habit and it perked him up before the drugs inside the dark-colored liquid even hit his nervous system. Another day, another dive into the bottomless morass that was Sector 809G of Hive Roshan. Part of the far-flung Minerva cluster, Roshan was one of the smallest of the great Hive cities, and despite the presence of all the various clan houses of Hive Primus, relatively peaceful. Emphasis, of course, on relatively, especially lately. The problem with peace is it leads to complacency, it leads to comfort, it leads to budget cuts. The combo of less enforcers and complacent enforcers could be deadly. Last week, a raid went bad and 3 officers got their heads split. Carstock was recovering, but the other 2 bled out on the operating table. Central sent a rookie to replace them, but trading 3 experienced officers for a greenhorn was basically a joke. Everyone was on overtime now, including Lau, who had only gotten 4 hours of rack time in the back of the precinct before starting his shift. He read reports, scanning for something that he could handle alone. The Quinspirus pox had laid low several of the precinct's remaining officers, so in addition to the longer shifts, they were down to 2-man patrols, with Lau being the odd man out. As captain of the precinct, he commanded enough respect to generally be able to venture out alone, and he liked it that way. It was quieter. That said, a solo officer can't be breaking down doors to stop gas growers or unauthorized wild snake bootleggers, both of which came packing heat. No, he would need to find something that he could run down and clear quickly, hopefully without needing to even discharge his firearm. He flipped to the next printout, and there it was. A nice, simple complaint about vibration from a Factoria causing disruptions in a Vansar silicone pressing facility. He could serve the papers for the disruption and for their lack of a permit, and be back in the precinct house before midday, giving him time to clear another case before his 1 meal break in the evening. Then third shift, because the only thing he always said was that he wouldn't let anyone else under him do extra shifts unless he was willing to do it too. He was hard with the men, but also hard on himself, and in that way he got decent results despite the disinvestment in his operation. They brought in creds on the side where necessary to keep the lights on when the Prometheum Guild got grubby, but there were hard lines Lau struck to. Lines like no gassed, as the drug had a reputation for causing havoc wherever it touched. He had to give Helmar's mercy to a couple of officers who'd violated his rules early on, but hadn't been a problem since. Taking the complaint sheet off the stack and folding it, he glanced down at the next page. This was an intelligence report about the bombing of an enforcer precinct in another of Minerva's hives. Apparently the investigation hadn't turned up the organizers yet, but tracing back the subversive propaganda to its source was only a matter of time. Lau scoffed. The damage was long since done. The worker uprisings there were causing a sudden recall of resources to the hive, including a great recruiting of Venators and other hive scum. At that point, a hive is too far gone. Everything is going to be ripe for the picking. It's going to be absolute pandemonium. There's no way to turn back that chaos. He gathered his gear. He holstered his stub pistol. He took a shotgun from the weapons rack behind his desk. There was no sense in taking unnecessary risks. If he's going to go collect fines, he better bring the hardware to back up the implied threat of an enforcer captain at the door. He slugged the rest of his recaf and set off on the hike to lift B-2904. The slow procession of the large platform down into the industrial sector served as a convenient moment to burn a low stick, further heightening his reflexes despite his lack of sleep. A steady supply of glow sticks was one of the rare treats of this particular hive, as it hosted a massive greenhouse complex where the drug is cultivated. He would soon catch a ride on the goods shuttle to the block where the complaint was wired in. Everything looked normal, he thought. He was always a little anxious to barge in on unauthorized Factoria. There was a sort of de facto hands-off relationship with the squatters. As long as they churned out tithe and the true owner wasn't attempting to use the space, it behooved officers to get the transgressions out of the way and let them slide with only fines. This both created an incentive to use your own space if you were an owner, and it maximized the output of those doing the piracy. That said, when non-permitted activity damages official clan house facilities, that gets you a call fast. He walked along the perimeter of the building, getting a sense of its size, and returned to the front gate to buzz. He could hear light footfalls on the other side of the door, then the clank of a bolt being removed. A jittery-looking boy with pale skin cracked the door. "Sir, can I help you?" Annoyed, Lau lifted his visor. "Boy, I need to speak with the person in charge here. ASAP, you hear me?" "Sir, I beg your pardon, but the present moment that would be me." Lau was immediately annoyed. There was no way a lucrative factory operation was answering to a Jew who had scarcely needed to shave in his life. "Boy, I don't have time to play games. I know you aren't the only one here. This is about a fine." The boy's eyes filled with fear. But sir, I didn't mean to imply I was the only one here. I'm the only one who can speak." Ah, so this was a servitor operation. Probably some fly-by-night ring making knockoff Van Saw rifles. Half the price, but a third as reliable. Still, leaving things to a small child was strange. It left the equipment vulnerable. Lau noticed the boy glance to his right and realized immediately someone was there. Lifting his shotgun to aim, he kicked the cracked door open and barged into the room. What he saw shocked him. A man, seemingly anyway, short, with pronounced ridges on his forehead, and the strangest of all, what appeared to be a third arm, less human-looking than the others, with 3 fingers and sharp talons. A mutant. Lau had seen his fair share of the cursed birth before, but never quite like this. He fired his shotgun, ripping a hole in the mutant's torso and collapsing it. He then turned to the boy. "Are there more of them?" The boy nodded. "Many, sir, and they'll have had the gun. They will come." Lau grunted in acknowledgement. "Then you should run. Get as far from here as you can. Oh, and boy, lying to an agent of the Imperial House is a serious crime. You're lucky I have business with these freaks, or you'd be my first caller of the day." The boy nodded and ran, and as he fled into the alley, Lau turned his attention to the dark corridors of the Factoria, his various scanning equipment detecting movement, and a moment later, he was in a firefight. Autogun fire ripped through the air, and he found himself diving behind cover. He waited. A lone enforcer knows to be patient. The clang of bulkhead as someone approached. Blam, the report of the shotgun as it shredded the worker. Lau took the opportunity to advance, trying to stay out of sight from his would-be assailants. 2 came looking for him now. He killed the first, but the second lunged, a fighting knife finding a joint in his armor and grazing his ribs. They wrestled for a moment before Lau got the upper hand, driving the blade into its master's throat. Unfortunately, the struggle had knocked him out of his cover. An autogun burst impacted his helmet and chest plate, denting both and knocking him down. He reflexively tossed a grenade in the direction of the bullets, a satisfying grunt coming from the explosion. He collected himself. The boy had said many. That could mean a dozen or 100. His heads-up display was damaged by the shot that had hit his helmet, but he was able to discern a factory floor and, indeed, what appeared to be dozens of servitors milling about doing assembly line tasks. Efficient. This was an experienced crew. They definitely knew well enough that they'd be getting an enforcer down here eventually, which explains the kid. A nice, placid-looking kid without any strange mutations would be a perfect tool for throwing off anything approaching close scrutiny. But what were these things? He reached a doorway to the main factory floor and waited a moment. Heat signatures shone through the walls, and they gathered on the other side, likely discussing the gunshots and the radio silence from their companions who had went to examine the sound. Soon, an impatient worker started to the door, gripping the handle. As it began to open, Lau fired the shotgun again, tossing smoke grenade after smoke grenade through the threshold to cover his entry. As he killed his way through the gathered mutants, he exhausted almost all of his remaining shotgun rounds. He drew his stub pistol, thinking about the small number of bullets on his person, thinking about how long it would take to retrieve a handful of rounds from a pouch in a live fire situation where the unknown number of attackers could approach at any angle. Several more of the work crew, who had the standard number of arms, began searching for the source of the blinding smoke and gunshots, walking themselves into a trap each caught off guard and given the Emperor's mercy. The stub gun was a crude weapon, but it was endlessly effective. It was then that they heard a roar of a chainsaw and turned and saw a mutant that was almost more creature than man. He fired the final shell of his shotgun, but the creature charged anyway, seemingly unfazed by the shot penetrating his flesh. He brought his shock baton up, and for a moment they were as two dancers, each seeking to draw the other's blood, each fast enough to stay ahead of the baton and blade. But as Lau took a step back, suddenly he slipped, and he fell, and in doing so, the brute's saw cut deeply into his leg. He aimed his stub gun, and there was a satisfying squish as the bullet burst out the back of his assailant's skull. Lau had done it. He had killed what was assuredly one of the most dangerous creatures in this hive, but at what cost? The room was quiet now, other than the sound of servitors working the assembly line. Lau began to search for his med pack, a race against the lightheaded feeling that he knew was an early sign of shock. He just needed the gauze. Everything went black. 1 week later, Lau blinked. He had eyes. He was in a bed. It smelled clean. What had happened? How drunk was I last night? He asked himself. It was only when he tried to move that he discovered the agony that had landed him in the enforcer wing of the hospital. His leg wouldn't budge, but it did hurt more than anything he'd ever experienced before. He grunted, hoping to get the attention of someone on the staff. He needed to know the status of the precinct. He needed to know how long he'd been out. Duty does not end simply because you're injured. But first, he needed to get someone's attention.